Sorry, have a question here, because that's what we started. Well, we talked about it a bit yesterday about the intergenerational trauma, and how the challenge of like, what do you do with it if you're coming from the outside, like you're the person from America, and then you come to Vietnam and you can see very clearly all the things which are, well, in which the modern generation is experiencing challenges, and all the deviations from a so-called norm. And me being a child who grew up in Russia, but I didn't grow up in the Soviet Union. I grew up after the Iron Curtain fell. So what I have incorporated as normal is, well, what is normal for American people based on the culture, on the movies. But if you look at history and at what preceded, like, there is a huge difference there. There is a huge gap. And so I suppose that if you would come to Russia, you would also look around and, see perhaps somewhat overlapping conflicts that people are experiencing in Vietnam. Of course, it would be somewhat different, but it would be very clear for you from the outside perspective, all the things which system, is imperfect, let's say. And it might be easy to point out, okay, so this should be fixed, and that should be fixed, and that should be fixed, because it's easy for us to see all the things which are wrong whenever we step into a different system. It could be, you come to your friend's home, you see how your friend is communicating with the parents, and you see all the things which are wrong with it and which should be fixed. But the thing is that it's not always possible to do from the inside, especially with all the preceding history. So how can one help a person to self-regulate, taking into account all the limitations of the existing system, like respecting those limitations, because it is the way it is, and you can't just expect that person to, jump to what is normal for some other country or some other culture. No, unfortunately, it's impossible. But how can they self-regulate based on what is?
I think that's a very important question, because whatever those limitations are and wherever they've come from, it isn't for anyone to judge them in ways that are purely critical. Okay? The limitations come from the ways that people have coped with what's been difficult. And we have to applaud and respect and understand that the pressures that have existed throughout history have created certain coping methods that then become, on one hand, allowing society and people to move forward, but on the other hand, not the same thing as being able to live fully and consciously. So this is why intergenerational trauma or tradition or religion or any of the overlays that we've inherited are, on one hand, a very important part of our collective history, and on the other hand, can be those things that keep us from a freedom to continue to evolve and become conscious in ways. So first of all, the idea of fixing what that isn't something that I would want to do or try to do. I would say, how do we allow ourselves to move beyond it, okay, to emerge from it? Kind of like what you described when you were talking about raising children in ways that might be less diminishing to their sense of self, or allowing them to discover even from a young age who they are, rather than having external things imposed on them. So I think And it's interesting because America doesn't have a common tradition. The roots in America are not very deep. And in fact, I think America's history, the tradition, has been there's been substitutes. And unfortunately, I think one substitute is an over-identification with a certain kind of set of religious beliefs. And the other is consumer culture, which is buy things, let's be future-minded, let's be, progress as a goal, when in fact it's had a lot of problems, to think that we should always be more and better and newer and trendier, all the things that drive a sense of what it means to be successful or progressive. So America has an immature version of the same thing that maybe other cultures have as a part of their own history or tradition. And so I don't think America is any example of what we want to try to be like. But I would say that there is a little bit more freedom for alternatives. And I think I'm a pretty good example of that. Because I came out of that religious overlay into a society that had a lot of room, including alternative lifestyles, and including my discovery of the importance of creativity and art as a means of expression, which is then directly connecting back to, I can be myself in a way. So, and I think this is true no matter where we are in the world. Often it is the creatives, the people who are saying, I'm somehow, taking that and making it new, that find the consciousness that I think we're talking about. And that's why we call this creative play residency, is because we value what that is all about, that when we play, and when we're creative, we're stepping into aspects of ourselves that we can discover. And I'm not very interested in all trying to fix things. I think the way we do it is we prioritize what comes next, in terms of what's possible. And that becomes the alternative. And I think we're all examples of it, and most of the people that show up here are kind of past the set of limits, and we're at the, and I'm old, so I've had more time to figure out what that means, for me anyways. And as a therapist, it's also how I see my work, the role of helping people get unstuck from whatever limiting beliefs or the overemphasis of guilt or shame or some limiting subtext to who they are. And once people start to get their needs met. Basically, it's to get their needs met so that they're not living their life trying to get their needs met, okay? And when their needs are met, when our needs are met, then we become more open to the potential that exists, and not knowing exactly what that is.
I just had a thought right now, talking about being true to yourself, and how do you call this one? You mentioned about being true to yourself and embrace your full potentiality, let's say, like an optimized individual or human being. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like if you're able to meet all of your needs as an individual, you'll be so detached from everything, because you will just keep on the following that path that you're into. And it also kind of feels like if you're detached, you will not let the external world influence who you are, how you feel, everything about you. So that's a strong sense of self that you will have, but then it also means that people who might be still in that state of attachment, you will hurt a lot of them. Especially if you are someone who's going to be grounding somewhere and then you have that person, you're that person. But then if you follow that path, you will always leave people behind. I don't know, it's just like a thought formulating from all the conversations that we have.
I think it's a really interesting observation because, the relationship that we have then to the world we're in becomes quite, can feel quite separate, and I think there's a point at which we move from the more literal versions of connection to the connection to humanity. So the idea of being part of humanity is quite different than being in specific relationships to specific people. Okay, so, and I think this is also true of many artists and authors and people who are expanding beyond the specific dynamics that they're in. And it doesn't mean that those have to be painful or difficult. They can be, though, because I will say that the to be truly individualized, actualized, is also quite threatening to people for whom that's not true, who would rather cling to their tradition or their religion or their belief system, because fitting in and belonging is more important than being uniquely separate. And so sometimes a person who is uniquely separate can find a tension in the dynamic because it's a threat in a certain way. So I think you're right, we have to be careful not to, certainly not to intentionally hurt people or to hurt people carelessly. But on the other hand, sometimes people are hurt because they're too over-identified with something that you're not, and that's part of the struggle or the pain of life, is they have to. For me, that's on them, But I think this, so for me, there's these stages. One is the stage where we're sort of living inside the bubble of ideas about who we are, okay? And we have these labels and these titles, and we're seeking approval so that we can, be at least on the positive side if I'm liked and I'm approved of and all that. If we can break out of that bubble and forget and care less about what other people think, or care less about identifying as a particular idea of who we are, then we can start to live in the experience of living. Okay, so we're now more part of just living life as it's happening. Okay, and it seems to me that beyond that, there's a sense that the particular person I am kind of starts to blend into humanity. Okay, so we lose not only the idea of who we are, we also lose an over-identification of my specialness or my separateness. We're human being human, okay? You could say that's a kind of a spiritual thing, in the sense that if we think of like a career title, I'm a therapist, okay? That's an idea. But if we think of my soul as experiencing, having a human experience, that's not a very fixed idea. The word soul or spirit or even life energy is quite nebulous. And when we allow for that to be true, and we're just living and giving ourselves the freedom to do that.
Have you passed that barrier, Douglas, like living outside?
I think I get a glimpse of it now and then, but I think I can swing right back into all this painful over-identification with a responsibility for. And yeah, I'm not one or another, but I do think I think one of the advantages of being old is that if you keep learning, then you too keep seeing what's possible. And I think the fact that I can put it into words means I do know something about that. Now, believe me, I'm not trying to paint some picture of anything other than just somebody stumbling through life and discovering I'm alone and I better do this because nobody's going to do it for me, and how can I do it with care and compassion and kindness, and how can I let myself go along with life, go along with the flow of life, So.
I have a question. You mentioned a little bit about the idea of attachment, and I sometimes wonder about the healthy aspect or the healthy part of when you attach to people or even to material things, like how that help us to cross the borders of our limits sometimes, and even like discover some things that are actually not in this layer of ourselves, as you were explaining. And you do things for others because that attachment you have, and the benefits, or I don't really want to call it benefits, but the healthier part of the attachment.
I think it's another way to say grounded, okay? Because we are living in the present, and we are living in ways that have to do with our body and our direct experience. And